There was no argument that morning, no raised voices or slammed doors, and somehow that silence felt heavier than any fight Jenny and Sumit had ever survived together. Jenny sat quietly on the edge of the bed, folding her clothes with slow, careful movements, the same clothes she had worn through years of waiting, hoping, and convincing herself that patience was love. Each fold felt deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if she were closing a chapter she had already finished reading long ago. Sumit stood in the doorway watching her, unable to ask the question he already knew the answer to, because saying it out loud would make it real. Outside, the sounds of the city carried on as usual, traffic, distant voices, life continuing without pause, while inside that small room, something deeply personal was coming to an end without spectacle or drama. When Sumit finally asked if she was angry, Jenny paused, holding one of his shirts for a moment before placing it gently back into the drawer, not taking it with her, not rejecting it either, just leaving it behind where it belonged. Her voice was soft when she answered, almost calm, and that calmness frightened him more than anger ever could, because anger still meant emotion, still meant connection. Silence meant acceptance, and acceptance meant there was nothing left to argue about. For years, Jenny had waited through lies that remembered too late, through family resistance that never softened, through promises that always sounded sincere but somehow never arrived at the future they described. Waiting had become her full-time job, and slowly, without anyone noticing, waiting turned into exhaustion. What Sumit didn't understand yet was that Jenny had already cried all the tears she had left, quietly, in the middle of the night, lying beside him while he slept believing they still had time. She wasn't leaving in anger or disappointment, she was leaving after reaching peace, and peace doesn't ask for permission. When she finally said she couldn't keep waiting for a life that never showed up, Sumit felt something inside him crack open, because for the first time he understood that this wasn't another delay or another promise to fix things later. This was the end. As Jenny zipped her suitcase and stood up to leave the room, Sumit felt a fear he had never experienced before, the fear of realizing that love doesn't always explode or fall apart loudly. Sometimes it fades quietly, slowly, so gently that by the time you notice it slipping away, it's already gone, and all you're left with is the sound of silence where a future used to be. After Jenny stepped out of the room, Sumit remained standing in the doorway long after she was gone, staring at the empty space where her suitcase had been, as if his mind hadn't yet caught up with what his eyes were seeing. The apartment felt different immediately, not louder or colder, just unfamiliar, like something essential had been quietly removed while he wasn't paying attention. He sat down on the bed where she had been moments earlier, the sheets still warm, and for the first time in years, there was no plan to talk things through, no reassurance waiting at the end of the conversation. For so long, Sumit had believed that as long as Jenny stayed, everything was still fixable, that time was on their side simply because she kept choosing him again and again. But now, with the door closed and her footsteps fading away, he realized how much he had relied on her patience as proof of love, mistaking endurance for permanence. Memories began rushing in without warning, the early days when everything felt impossible but exciting, the secret calls, the stolen moments, the promises whispered late at night about a future that always seemed just one obstacle away. Back then, fear had felt temporary, something they could outlast together, but fear had quietly settled into their daily lives, shaping every decision, every delay, every excuse. Sumit pressed his hands against his face, trying to steady his breathing, but the weight of realization kept sinking deeper. Jenny hadn't left suddenly, she had been leaving in pieces for a long time. Every time he asked her to wait a little longer, every time he chose comfort over confrontation, every time he believed love alone could survive without action. He thought about all the moments he had told her as soon, never understanding how heavy that word had become for someone whose life was already defined by waiting. For Jenny, time had never paused, it had kept moving forward, taking years with it, while Sumit kept believing there would always be another chance. Now, sitting alone in the silence he once avoided, he felt something tighten in his chest, not just heartbreak, but regret, sharp and unmistakable. He realized too late that Jenny's calm wasn't indifference, it was exhaustion, the kind that comes when someone finally accepts that wanting something doesn't make it real. As the room grew quieter, Sumit's composure finally cracked, and the tears came not in dramatic sobs, but in slow, uncontrollable waves, because this loss didn't feel sudden or shocking, it felt final. And in that moment, Sumit understood the cruel truth that waiting doesn't always bring people closer together. Sometimes, it simply teaches one person how to leave. By the time Jenny stepped outside and felt the weight of the door close behind her, she wasn't crying, and that absence of tears told a deeper story than any breakdown ever could. Her grief hadn't arrived in this moment, it had been spread out over years, absorbed quietly during nights when she lay awake beside Sumit, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much longer a person could pause their life without losing themselves entirely. Walking down the street, suitcase rolling behind her, she moved with the steadiness of someone who had already made peace with an ending long before it officially happened. For a long time, Jenny had convinced herself that love meant patience, that standing still was a sacrifice worth making if it led to a shared future. But patience, she slowly learned, can turn into erasure when it demands everything and gives nothing back. She remembered the promises that once felt hopeful, the reassurances that sounded sincere, and the way each so soon had quietly replaced the one before it, stretching her trust thinner with every repetition. Jenny had defended Sumit for years, to friends, to family, and often to herself, believing that love could survive distance, disapproval, and delay. Yet somewhere along the way, she stopped asking for clarity, not because she didn't need it, but because asking had become too exhausting. What hurt the most wasn't the waiting itself, but realizing that time kept moving forward without her consent, taking pieces of her confidence, her certainty, and her sense of belonging with it. She hadn't stopped loving Sumit overnight, she had simply stopped believing that love alone was enough to build a life. As she paused at the corner of the street and looked back once, Jenny didn't feel anger toward him, only a quiet sadness for two people who wanted the same thing but never at the same time. She understood now that staying had begun to cost her more than leaving ever would. The hardest truth she carried with her wasn't that the relationship had failed, but that she had waited so long hoping things would change that she almost forgot she was allowed to change too. In choosing to walk away, Jenny wasn't rejecting Sumit as a person, she was choosing herself after years of putting her own needs last. And as the sounds of the city swallowed her footsteps, she felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not relief exactly, but the fragile beginning of freedom, the kind that comes only after you accept that some love stories don't end because people stop caring, but because holding on starts to hurt more than letting go. As the hours passed, Sumit found himself replaying moments he once believed were small, now realizing they were quiet warnings he had ignored. He remembered how Jenny had slowly stopped asking about timelines, how her questions softened and then disappeared altogether, replaced by a careful politeness that felt easier than disappointment. At the time, he mistook her calm for understanding, never recognizing it as resignation. The memories arrived in fragments, shared meals eaten in silence, conversations that ended too quickly, laughter that didn't linger the way it used to. Each moment felt harmless on its own, but together they formed a pattern he could no longer deny. Sumit had always believed that love meant staying, that as long as they remained together physically, everything else could be figured out later. But later had become a place they never reached. He thought about the times Jenny had tried to explain how heavy the waiting felt, how she had asked him to choose clarity over comfort, only for him to reassure her without changing anything. Those reassurances, once meant to calm her, now echoed in his mind as reminders of opportunities lost. Meanwhile, Jenny moved through her day with a strange mix of sadness and steadiness, noticing how different the world looked when she was no longer bracing herself for disappointment. Every step she took away from the life she had built around waiting felt both painful and necessary, like healing that stings before it soothes. She remembered how often she had pushed her own needs aside to protect Sumit from conflict, believing that love required sacrifice, never realizing how uneven that sacrifice had become. For Sumit, the realization came slowly and then all at once. The distance between them hadn't started with her decision to leave, it had begun the moment he stopped acting and started delaying. Sitting alone, he understood that Jenny hadn't abandoned him, she had simply stopped abandoning herself. That truth landed heavier than any accusation ever could. Love, he realized, isn't measured by how long someone waits, but by how willing you are to move forward together. And as night settled in and the apartment grew quieter, Sumit faced the painful clarity that the space between him and Jenny wasn't created by distance or circumstance, but by time passing without direction. What once felt like patience now revealed itself as hesitation, and hesitation had quietly written the ending of their story long before either of them had the courage to say goodbye. As night fell, the quiet inside the apartment became unbearable, pressing in on Sumit from every direction until there was nowhere left to escape his thoughts. He tried distracting himself, pacing from room to room, touching objects that suddenly felt like evidence of a life he hadn't protected, Jenny's mug by the sink, her shoes near the door, the faint scent she always left behind without realizing it. Each detail reminded him that this wasn't a temporary separation or a pause meant to scare him into action, it was the consequence of years spent believing he could delay decisions without losing anything. When he finally sat down, the weight of everything he had avoided settled heavily on his chest, and his composure broke. The tears came slowly at first, then with a force he couldn't control, not because Jenny had left, but because he finally understood why. For the first time, Sumit allowed himself to acknowledge the truth he had been avoiding, that love without movement becomes a promise without meaning. He thought about all the times he had asked Jenny to wait just a little longer, never stopping to consider what waiting cost her emotionally, mentally, and physically. He realized how often he had chosen the safety of delay over the risk of confrontation, believing that keeping everyone calm was the same as doing the right thing. But calm had come at a price, and Jenny had paid it alone. As he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands covering his face, Sumit felt the full weight of regret settle in, sharp and undeniable. He wasn't grieving the loss of Jenny in the abstract, he was grieving the man he could have been if he had chosen differently. For years, he had believed love was something that could survive on hope alone, but now he understood that hope without action only stretches pain over time. Jenny's decision wasn't cruel, and that realization hurt even more, because it meant there was no one to blame but himself. Her calm exit, her lack of anger, had stripped away every excuse he once relied on. In that stillness, Sumit faced the irreversible truth that some moments, once past, never return, no matter how sincere the regret that follows. And as he sat alone in the dim light of the apartment, Sumit finally broke down, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet way that comes when you realize love didn't fail you. You failed to meet it in time. By the next morning, the tears had dried, but the emptiness remained, heavier and more permanent than the night before. Sumit moved through the apartment slowly, noticing how every routine felt broken now that Jenny was gone, as if the space itself was reminding him of what he had lost. He made coffee out of habit, only to realize there was no one to share it with, no quiet conversation waiting at the table, no gentle presence filling the silence. For the first time, Sumit wasn't thinking about how to fix things or what promise he could make next, he was thinking about consequences. He understood now that Jenny's decision hadn't been impulsive or emotional, but deeply considered, shaped by years of patience slowly turning into clarity. The realization forced him to confront a painful truth. He had always known what Jenny needed, he had just believed he could postpone giving it without losing her. Looking back, he saw how often Jenny had compromised, how rarely he had matched her sacrifices with action. Meanwhile, Jenny found herself in a different kind of quiet, one that felt unfamiliar but honest. Without the constant tension of waiting, her thoughts moved more freely, and she began to recognize how much of her identity had been tied to uncertainty. She wasn't celebrating her decision, but she wasn't questioning it either. The sadness she felt was real, but it was no longer mixed with doubt. For Sumit, reflection slowly replaced denial. He realized that love isn't proven by endurance alone, but by alignment, by two people moving forward together instead of standing still for each other. Jenny hadn't walked away because she stopped caring, she walked away because caring without progress had become unbearable. This understanding didn't ease the pain, but it gave it meaning. Sumit finally saw that waiting had never been neutral, it had quietly shaped the outcome of their relationship. Every delay had been a decision in itself, one that pushed the ending closer without him realizing it. As the day unfolded, Sumit accepted something he had long resisted, that some love stories don't end with betrayal or loss of feeling, but with one person choosing clarity after years of confusion. Jenny's absence was no longer just a physical void, it was a mirror reflecting everything he had avoided. And in that reflection, Sumit faced the long-term impact of her choice, not just the end of their relationship, but the lesson that love requires courage in the present, not promises for the future. As the days passed, the sharpness of the pain slowly softened, not because Sumit missed Jenny any less, but because he was finally allowing himself to accept what had happened instead of resisting it. Acceptance didn't arrive as peace, it arrived as honesty. He stopped replaying conversations in search of a different ending and began acknowledging the reality that their love had been real, but unfinished. Jenny, in her own quiet way, carried that same understanding with her. She didn't erase Sumit from her life or rewrite their story as a mistake. Instead, she recognized it as a chapter that had shaped her, taught her resilience, and ultimately showed her the cost of waiting too long for certainty. For Sumit, the absence of Jenny became a teacher, revealing truths he had once been too afraid to face. He understood now that love asks for bravery, not just in words, but in action, and not someday, but when it matters most. Looking back, he could see how fear had disguised itself as patience, how hesitation had worn the mask of care. Jenny hadn't asked for perfection, she had asked for direction. And when that direction never came, she chose herself. That choice, once painful to accept, slowly transformed into respect. Sumit no longer saw her departure as abandonment, but as self-preservation. The weight of that realization stayed with him, reshaping how he understood love, commitment, and responsibility. Meanwhile, Jenny learned that choosing peace doesn't erase love, it simply changes its form. She could miss Sumit without regretting her decision, and that balance felt like healing. Their story, once fueled by hope and defiance, now rested in reflection and understanding. It didn't end with betrayal or bitterness, but with a quiet acknowledgement that timing matters just as much as feeling. Some people meet at the wrong moment, not because they don't care enough, but because life demands clarity when one person is still searching for courage. As acceptance settled in, both Jenny and Sumit carried the emotional meaning of their journey forward, not as a failure, but as a reminder that love must be met with action before patience turns into goodbye. In the end, Jenny and Sumit's story didn't conclude with shouting, betrayal, or a dramatic collapse. It ended the way many real love stories do, quietly, after all the waiting had already done its damage. Their journey was built on deep affection, shared dreams, and the belief that love could outlast time, fear, and uncertainty, but it ultimately revealed a harder truth: love alone isn't enough when action never arrives. Jenny's final decision wasn't an act of anger or punishment, it was the result of years spent hoping that patience would eventually be rewarded. Sumit's breakdown didn't come because he stopped loving her, but because he finally understood the cost of delaying what mattered most. Their ending reminds us that silence can be louder than arguments, and calm goodbyes often carry the deepest pain. Sometimes, people don't leave because they stop caring, they leave because caring without progress becomes unbearable. Jenny chose herself not because she stopped loving Sumit, but because she could no longer lose herself in waiting. And Sumit learned, perhaps too late, that love requires courage in the present, not promises for the future. As viewers, their story asks a quiet question we rarely want to answer: how long is patience still love, and when does it become self-abandonment? Because in real life, endings don't always arrive with chaos. Sometimes they arrive softly, after one person finally accepts that waiting is no longer a choice they can afford. And in that silence, a long love story doesn't explode, it simply closes, leaving behind a lesson that lingers long after the goodbye. Even after everything was said and done, the weight of Jenny and Sumit's story continued to linger, not because it was unresolved, but because it was painfully relatable. Long after the suitcases were unpacked and the silence settled into something familiar, both of them carried the quiet imprint of what they had been to each other. For Sumit, certain moments still arrived without warning: a song playing in a passing car, a phrase spoken by a stranger, an empty chair across the table, each one gently reopening a memory he once thought time would erase. He didn't reach out, not because he didn't care, but because he finally understood that respecting Jenny's decision was the last thing love asked of him. Jenny, too, felt those echoes, but they no longer pulled her backward. Instead, they reminded her of how strong she had become by choosing clarity over comfort. She didn't rewrite their past as a mistake or a waste, she honored it as something real that simply couldn't continue without costing her more than she could give. Their story became a quiet lesson in timing, showing that love can exist without lasting forever, and that endings don't cancel the meaning of what came before. Sometimes, people meet to teach each other something essential, not to stay indefinitely. Sumit learned that hesitation has consequences, and Jenny learned that self-respect sometimes requires walking away from what you still love. In another life, under different circumstances, their story might have unfolded differently, but real life doesn't bend for what-ifs. It only responds to choices made, or avoided. And so their love settled into memory, not as a tragedy, but as a reminder that patience is powerful, but it isn't infinite. When the narrator steps back and looks at their journey, what remains isn't blame or regret, but a simple truth many people recognize too late: love asks for presence, courage, and action while time is still offering them. Jenny and Sumit's story didn't end loudly, but it continues to speak quietly to anyone who has ever waited, hoped, or stayed longer than they should have. Because sometimes, the most heartbreaking love stories aren't the ones that end suddenly, but the ones